Good morning. I'm Richard Blackaby, and I want to welcome you to the Tuesday morning devotional. We have gone to once a month format, and so those of you that were used to being with us every Tuesday morning, I hope that you had it on your calendars and you're joining us this morning. Of course, you can watch this later recorded as well. Want to just also just remind you or let you know that on May 17 to 19, we're going to be at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove. If you've never been there, it's a beautiful, beautiful location, perfectly designed to give you a spiritual getaway. My son Daniel and I'll be there. Might drag the parents there, but Daniel and I'll be there speaking and just talking about how to increase your influence. If you're a grandparent, if you're a parent, and you look at the younger generation and you think, how can I have an influence on them and help them navigate through this very perilous world in which they are growing up in, or you're at work and you're a business person but wanting to have an influence for God there, or even in your nation with all that's going on. We'll be talking about even if you're an ordinary person, which most all of us are, God can still give you a greater influence over the people around you, an influence for good and for God. And so, if you've never been to the Cove, or even if you have, I think we all just need those little getaways just to draw close to God and His Word. And so put that on your calendar. We'll put a link in the notes there so you can click on that link. It'll take you right to the registration at the Cove. Beautiful place. It'll be a beautiful time of year. So I hope you can join us. Well, some of you who follow us on our social media know that this past Wednesday was a very challenging day for us. My mother had been diagnosed with some aggressive cancer in her ureter tube, which is a tube that goes between the bladder and the kidney. They found 3 different clusters of cancer, of tumors, and they were quite aggressive. And the surgeon said, we've got to get in there right away. And so last Wednesday morning, of course, all the family was praying, and our primary prayer was, besides just it all would go well, was that it would not have spread, that it would still be contained, even though it was an aggressive variety. That same day, I had 2 other relatives, very close relatives to me, that one was getting a test to find out if they had a brain tumor, and another whether they had stomach cancer. And so all of that was on last Wednesday for me. So I all day long was waiting for different doctors' reports to come back and to hear how bad the news might be. Fortunately, grateful to God, the tests all came back pretty well. The surgeon felt he got all the cancer from my mother. Um, Neurologist didn't think it was a brain tumor that was causing the problem, and it was ruled out that the other relative had stomach cancer. And so, doesn't mean that there aren't challenges, but I don't know if you've been like that, and you've just had those moments where it seemed as if there was a perfect storm in your life, where all the news was bad, and maybe there was trouble at work, or trouble with kids, trouble with health, um, just so many different crises that can arise in a person's life. And sometimes, even as a Christian, you may wonder, well, God, where are you in this? Where is God in the storm and in the crisis? And of course, those of us here in America know that there's a very polarized society in which we live, an increasingly secular society that completely disagrees with Christian values and perspectives. There's a political divide, a polarization of society today. And there are many Christians quite concerned about all that is happening in the country. Before we have another one of these Bible studies, we'll have an election for president and senators and congressmen. And so you probably may well be one of those people saying, there is so much going on right now. Where is God in this? Is God involved? Or has he just taken his hand off, and is he letting American society just fall apart? Well, there's interesting, and I think for me, one of my favorite places to turn, especially in times like this, is in Revelation chapter 1. And I want to just read several verses and just draw a few parallels from the first century to our century, our times, because God is the very same. And what you discover when you look at history is that many of the situations in life remain the same as well. Also, just want to encourage you, as we've done in these devotions, that we welcome questions. If you'd like to just write a question in the chat portion of the screen, then I'll try to get to those before our time is done this morning. And so you just be thinking, if something I say makes you think of a question, or maybe something's not quite clear, then you feel free to write that in, and I'll try to get to that before our time is done. But Revelation chapter 1, beginning in verse 9, it says, I, John, your brother and partner in the affliction, kingdom, and endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. So John is, by this time, probably the only living disciple left. All the other 12 have died, and many of the early Christian leaders are gone. The Apostle Paul is probably dead by this time, and John's an old man. And of course, if you're one of the 12 disciples, the only one left, you're the one that Jesus loved, you would think that you would be treated with kid gloves, revered, honored, but he's been thrown in jail. He's on a prison island off the coast of Asia, and he is whiling away his time in exile. He's got so many concerns about the church and the various attacks coming against it. Obviously, the government, society is hostile toward the Christian faith, for John himself has been imprisoned because of the gospel. And there may be times where you might be thinking, society is becoming so hostile toward the Christian faith. It's not easy anymore to take a stand for Jesus or to hold on to biblical values because the society in which we live is becoming increasingly hostile toward that. Well, you need to know that throughout 2,000 years of church history, there have often been times when the government, culture, society was hostile toward Christianity. But the historical record would demonstrate that typically Christians have done quite well in such times. It has many times awakened the church. It has caused people to be more devout. And so here, John has been exiled to a prison island. It seems as if a secular government, a hostile society, has pushed Christianity to the margins, and yet one of the most famous books in the Bible is about to be written. And a testimony, a word from God will go forth that will encourage millions of people for years to come. Sometimes in our darkest moments, when we'd be ready to give up, God's about to do some of his greatest work. And so here a message comes to John while he's on this island. He says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And basically he's praying. He's communing with God. And folks, when things get really difficult, when it seems as if society's falling apart, that's the time to be praying and turning your attention to him. And it says, I heard a loud voice behind me like a trumpet, saying, write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Then I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was one like the Son of Man, dressed in a robe and with a golden sash wrapped around his chest. The hair of his head was as white as wool, white as snow, and his eyes like a fiery flame. His feet were like fine bronze, as it is fired in a furnace, and his voice like the sound of cascading waters. He had 7 stars in his right hand, a sharp double-edged sword came from his mouth, and his face was shining like the sun at full strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man. Now, several things just to point out to you about this. One is, notice that the risen Christ was present all along. Now, John may have been wondering, where is Christ? Why has he allowed me to be put in jail? Why has he prevented me from encouraging the churches? And yet, in this moment, he's going to discover that as he prays, he is reminded that the risen Christ hasn't gone anywhere, that he's very present. In fact, it says that he sees him walking among the lampstands, which means that He's walking among the churches. He's present. Folks, let me just encourage you that just because you don't see what God is doing at the moment doesn't mean he's not present, doesn't mean he's not working. It just means you don't see it. And it's interesting also that John is praying and he wants God to do something. And then it's interesting what God does, because God's going to encourage one of his chief disciples. And notice what he does. It says that, well, basically the risen Christ appears to John, but notice where he appears. He appears behind him. And it says several times, when I turned, then I saw him. And so sometimes it's interesting to me when you stop and you think, well, how is God doing what he's doing? With God, what he does is always important, but it's also important how he does it. Now, why does God appear behind him instead of in front of him? Why doesn't the risen Christ just suddenly appear straight in front of John, blows him away as he sees Christ suddenly appearing, but instead he appears behind him? Because what that means is until John turns around, until he looks the other way, he doesn't see the risen Christ. As long as he's looking this way, he doesn't see the most amazing sight he's ever seen. But as soon as he turns and looks in a different direction, suddenly he's blown away by the nearness, by the power, by the presence of the risen Christ. And one of the lessons that has meant for me is that if I'm not seeing Christ, if he seems hidden from me, if all I see is what the world is doing, what evil is doing, what the darkness is doing, then maybe I need to look somewhere else. Maybe I need to turn my gaze from what I have been looking at to where God is and where I can see him. I see some Christians today very fixated and looking at the news, looking at what people are saying, looking at what evil is doing, and it's discouraging them. They're beginning to ask, God, where are you in all this? Well, the reality is God's present, and they could see God, and they could see his activity if they were looking in the right place. I just want to assure you that even during this polarized society in which we live, I've heard many stories of God at work, God opening doors. People during this period of COVID that for the first time have been asking life and death questions and considering whether they're ready to catch a terminal illness and die from it or not. God is working, but if you just look at certain things, you'll get very discouraged. And by the way, it's easy to tell where you're looking. I just have to have a conversation with you and hear what you're troubled about. Are you troubled or are you encouraged? Are you excited about what God's up to, or are you discouraged by what people are doing? If you keep your eyes on people, you'll be discouraged. If John had kept his eyes on the Roman emperor, on the Roman soldiers guarding him, on the other prisoners, that many of them would have been despicable, evil criminals, it would have been easy for John to be quite discouraged. But when he looks at the risen Christ, all of a sudden there's no reason at all to be discouraged. My father used to always say, if you look at Christ on his throne, how could you ever be discouraged? When you see Christ as he is ruling the universe, how could you ever be discouraged by what anything people could do? But when you're not looking at him, when you're looking at people, then people begin to be magnified in your life, and evil and what it is doing becomes larger than it really is. And before long, you'll feel overwhelmed by that. And just notice one or two things about this sight. Now, by the way, remember that no one has known Jesus better than this John. John was probably a teenager when he began walking with Jesus as a disciple. He was there when Jesus fed the 5,000. He was there when Jesus raised people from the dead. He was in the boat when Jesus came walking on the water in the middle of the storm, got in the boat and calmed the storm. He was there on the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus was transfigured. He was there standing before the cross when Jesus was dying for the sins of humanity. He was one of the first people to get to the empty tomb and to realize it was empty. He was in the upper room when Jesus first appeared to the disciples. He was there at Pentecost, and he was there when Jesus ascended back to heaven. He saw all those things and many, many more things than that. And so you would kind of think that anyone who had seen all of that, it would be pretty hard to impress. You'd have to have quite a church service. You'd have to hear quite a sermon for John to be blown away and to say, "Boy, I've never heard that before. Boy, that was quite something." And yet, what happens here? He turns around and sees the risen Christ, and what does he do? He falls to the ground like a dead man. I mean, completely loses all of his strength, completely goes weak. Now, how could he be that overwhelmed by seeing a person that he had seen many, many times before? Well, it's the risen Christ, the victorious Christ. It's not just the Jesus in his human fleshly form. This is the risen Christ, the victorious Christ, the Christ who's ruling the universe. And when he saw this Jesus with all the veil taken away, all the human flesh that had been wrapped around him, and now he sees Christ as he is, it absolutely overwhelmed the Apostle John. By the way, do you need a fresh vision of who Christ is for you as well? I'll tell you one thing. If you're wringing your hands and worrying and fretting about what people are doing, you need a fresh vision of the risen Christ. You need to be reminded of how powerful he is, that he does rule, that he does reign, that there's nothing that is beyond his scope of power to handle. And you notice some of the things it says. It says that his face shone like the sun, brilliant, shining, bright, demonstrating his power, his divinity. And it says his eyes were like a flame of fire. And those eyes are amazing things. I think in part what that symbolizes is that he sees everything, that there's nothing hidden from him. By the way, when you go to pray, you don't need to inform God of what's happening. God, in case you didn't know, there's an election coming up. God, in case you didn't know, there's a lot of people polarized right now. You don't need to inform God about what's happening in your life or in your nation. He's far more aware of it than you are. He could tell you all kinds of things you're unaware of. He is present, and those eyes see everything. And then he's got a mouth with a sharp two-edged sword coming out of it. And when he speaks, it's like the sound of many waters. It's for a Greek mind, it was as loud of a sound as it could possibly be coming out of his mouth. And what I've come to realize again is that even though politicians are constantly trying to get in front of cameras and speak to people, it's really a word from God that makes all the difference. One word from God can dispel 10,000 words from people. And so we are inundated, we're flooded with words from people. But one word from God changes everything. And as we enter into this turbulent election cycle, we need to know that Christ has not vacated the premises. He's not suddenly gone powerless. It's not that he suddenly has nothing to say. But we may need to turn our attention away from 24-hour news channels long enough to at least hear what this risen Christ has to say about what's happening in our world. And you notice that that when John sees him, he goes limp. He's overwhelmed. And sometimes my father used to always say, "Will you not tremble in God's presence? Will you not tremble at a word from God?" If you're not moved by an encounter with God, then you're probably not looking closely enough. John knew Jesus better than anyone, but when he saw Christ as he is today, it absolutely overwhelmed him. And it says that he's got the keys to death and to Hades, to hell. And isn't that interesting? Probably the two things that are the most fearful for human beings. I can't imagine anything more fearful to people today than dying and hell. Is there anything more frightening than that? And yet, Jesus is holding the keys to those. In other words, he's got complete control of them. And no one goes into them. No one experiences them without his permission. And no one can be held there when he's got the keys and he chooses to release people and set them free. Here's someone who has faced the worst things that humanity can possibly face. He's died himself, and yet he's faced the greatest fears of humanity, and he's been absolutely victorious, and he walked away with the keys in his possession. And what he's saying is, if I could conquer and overcome that which you're most afraid of, then just be assured anything else you face, any other troubles or challenges, no matter what problems that you might encounter, I've got the keys to those too. There's nothing that you're afraid of, that you're worried about, that I don't have a key to lock it up and put it away, bring an end to it, to set people free, whatever I need to do. And so you don't need to worry because I've got the keys and I'm present in your midst. I'm with you. And so as I have walked with people, I've had to just say, look at this Christ and realize that that is the Christ that you pray to. That is the Christ who is overseeing America today. He's working out his purposes, not your purposes, but he's in charge and he knows what he's doing. And he will accomplish his will, even in America, regardless of what people are doing. People are just instruments. People are his tools. He raises them up, he takes them down. But it's this Christ who remains. Now, I don't know if any of you have any questions you have just as you've been facing and looking at what's coming ahead of us and the church, but welcome to invite you just to submit those in these final moments that we have this morning. Can I just encourage you that as we do approach an election, this is certainly a time for you to be praying like you never have. It's a time for you to be talking to God and getting his perspective on things. Remembering, too, that God does some of his greatest work in times of crisis, in times of tumult. And I've had a sense, too, that in recent days, although it seems like there are many agendas, many worldviews that oppose that of the biblical worldview that have been pushing its way into people's lives and into society, it's also being proven to be barren. As people have trusted in secularism, as they've trusted in science, as they've just trusted in just being self-centered and living their life for themselves. Coronavirus and some of the other things that have come in recent days has exposed the emptiness of that, the hopelessness of that. Even when you put your trust in science, it can't necessarily save you from a pandemic that is sweeping through the country. Just because you're listening to scientists or supposed experts on issues doesn't mean that you can sleep peacefully at night after you heard what they had to say. There are limits to human powers and abilities and knowledge and leadership. And if you put your trust in those things, inevitably you're going to be disappointed. But when you put your trust in this risen Christ, then you can sleep at night knowing that he is the one that you're trusting in. He holds the keys and he's present. And those eyes see everything that you're facing. And he knows what is coming up. He knows what you have waiting for you later this week or next. And he's fully prepared to make a difference in your life. And so as I look at this, I'm just reminded again of those moments in my life where I've needed to be reminded that this is the Christ that I serve. And certainly last week, last Wednesday, as we were waiting for this news and we were praying, I'll tell you what, it was good to know that I wasn't just praying to a doctrine. I wasn't just praying to a belief system, but I was praying to this Christ who, as I was sharing with him and asking him to intervene in these loved ones' lives, as I was reminded of who he is and what power he has, I had a peace to know that if he's in the room and he's taking charge, I've got nothing to fear, nothing to be afraid of. And so as you go into this fall season, certainly in these next few weeks as a Christian, keep your eye on this Christ, have confidence in him, and listen to what he has to say. Those words that have that mouth that has that two-edged sharp sword, be listening to what he has to say, because he can't guide you and know how you should conduct yourself, how you should discern what you're hearing, and how to live your life in a way that makes a difference. So my prayer for each of you is that as Christians, you will live your life in a way that is salt and light in a time in which that's desperately needed. So I hope that you're encouraged and take some time in these next few days just to go back and read Revelation chapter 1 and be reminded that this 21st century that we're in now is not the first time that Christians have felt oppressed and concerned and challenged by what was happening in government, what was happening in society at large, and the culture. Uh, every generation, every century has had those moments where it seemed as if evil and darkness was pervading. But in every generation, the risen Christ also made it clear that he had not left the scene, that he was still involved and walking among the churches. His eyes saw what was going on, and he had a word for that generation as well, just like he has one for ours. So I pray that God will empower you, he'll give you confidence and courage to be the salt and light that our nation desperately needs you to be in such a time as this.